Say hi to YouTube. All right. So the other day, yesterday, I think at this point, I was on a after panel that was talking about xenogenders, self ID, and other things. And something that I'm realizing now is that people have very poor understandings of freedom and very poor understandings of justice. And what I think we could do is clarify a few things. And the first thing that I think needs clarification is how we interpret violence. And if you're in my Discord, this is basically going to be the same rant. So like if you saw the rant in Discord, it's going to be like the same thing. But let's start with violence. Violence is just the removal of one's ability to choose in a situation. I'm saying it again. Violence is the removal of one's ability to choose in a situation. So what does that mean? Or rather, what's the current problem? The first problem is that for a lot of people, they treat violence as physical, as something that needs to be physically done and measurable. And the harm has to be like measurable for it to reach the threshold of violence. However, I think approaching violence as the removal of one's ability to choose in a situation can really just kind of save people's time. So let's kind of walk through that. Let's do like the obvious, right? Violence can be stabbing somebody in the stomach. If somebody stabs me in the stomach, they're removing my agency. They're infringing on my right to determine what happens to my body. If somebody comes over and tink, 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 then yeah, they are infringing upon my right to my own body and to decide what happens to my own body. That's violence. However, or additionally, if you misgender somebody, so using a pronoun that's inconsistent with what they want to be called, that is also violence. That is removing one's ability to choose in a situation. So if somebody chooses to use they, them pronouns, and you use he, him intentionally, that's violence. Now, violence isn't only intentional. You can do violence in unintentional ways, and we have the legal precedent for that as well. But the thing that you have to look at in most, if not all situations, is, are my actions removing the ability for someone to choose in a situation? And even more broadly, are my actions removing one's ability to externalize their freedom? And that, I think, is going to save people a lot of time. So, for example, neopronouns. You can say that they're stupid all you want. You can have all these like weird takes and all this other stuff, but by you choosing not to use someone's neopronouns, you are removing one's ability for somebody to decide and choose what they can be called. That's an important thing. Names matter. Words that we use to describe ourselves matters. So if I want to be known as Joe and I use they, them, you're going to call me Joe and use they, them. If you don't do that, especially if it's declared, then yeah, that's violence. You're removing my ability to choose what you can call me. It's not that hard. And for a lot of people, they're basically saying my comfort and my ability to logically strap what words you use to my reality says that, okay, I can, because this doesn't strap to my reality, remove your ability to choose what I call you. And since, quote unquote, because it happened yesterday, because I can't map Fox gender to my worldview and my logic and all this other nonsense, then I can remove your choice to be called that, to be considered that. Even though everybody has the right to choose what people call them. It's no different than like my name. Like my name is Joseph, right? Don't call me Joseph, just call me Joe. But if somebody calls me Jose, and we can talk about indexicals and stuff, like Jose and Joseph are not the same thing. And they point to different things. They have all these indexicals behind it, and this context and all this shit behind it. And again, if you choose to call someone something that is different than what they choose to call themselves as, that's violence. You're removing one's ability to choose what they're called. No different than someone being stabbed. Someone being stabbed and someone being misgendered, to me, in terms of violence, is identical. But here's the thing. We have to pay attention to situations where there are people who do this violence on purpose. Because there are situations where people do violence accidentally. So for instance, let's say you did not know somebody uses they, them pronouns. Let's just say that that's happened. You don't know they use they, them, and then you drop she. And then they go, and then here's what happens. Like, you did some violence there. However, there's redress involved, and that redress usually involves the person going, hey, those aren't my pronouns. I use they, them. And then you go, oh, that's my bad. And then you change your language. An easy way to not commit violence to another person. And again, violence for me is just the action of removing one's ability to choose in a situation. You just ask them. Even if what you see indexes to she, her, even if what you see indexes to believing that they are a woman, all these indexicals, you still just ask, even if you think it's obvious. So then you just, before like you even hit the ground, hey, what are your pronouns? Oh, my pronouns are they, them. Great, you can move on. So now you know what they are. Now you know what they choose to be called, and then you can move accordingly. I hope that makes sense. Now, here's another problem. There's the I don't know club. Because that happened yesterday in the conversation too. There are people who were saying like, well, what happens if I don't know? You ask. Even if they're not there. Crazy, right? It's almost like if somebody isn't in the room, you can ask what their pronouns are, even if they're not in the room. And that's something I think you ought to do. You ought to do that. So like if you're having a conversation about someone and you don't know what their pronouns are, you should ask. And then maybe somebody within the conversation knows and they can answer. And then if somebody's like, well, I don't know, then there's a bunch of ways that you can address them without committing violence. Because there are some situations where if you're in a situation where you don't know what their gender is, you ask, nobody knows either, and then you use they, them. Sure, we can work with that. We can work with that in a group of people. But the minute you know, you should change it. No different than if I just started calling Doe she, her, that's not correct. And here's what happens in a situation. If I'm talking about Doe and I'm using she, her, and that's not correct, and nobody clarifies to it's, that's a problem. Especially if there's people who know that in the conversation. That's also violence. Because if you see somebody doing an act of violence, again, violence is the removal of one's ability to choose in a situation. And this said, choosing what people describe you and call you, and you know what they want to be called, and you don't say anything when they're not there, that's violence. And again, I'm gonna keep saying this definition and how I'm observing violence here. I'm just observing violence as a removal of one's ability to choose in a situation, even when they're not there. And that's just how it is, man. Like, and I mean, Haas Rhoda said, nah, language isn't violence. Then I mean, isn't there a word that you can't call black people in public? Aren't there a lot of words that you can't call certain groups in public? It's almost like we can look back historically and just recognize, oh yeah, there are situations where language is violence. Again, violence is the action of removing one's ability to choose in a situation. So if you're removing the ability for somebody to choose what they want to be called, that's violence. Which is why I'm going to keep saying this definition over and over and over, because that's what I'm working with. Because if you look at these interactions as just practices in externalizing freedom, you can really just work out these things, right? Like, you can work these out in your everyday life. So it's like, hey, are my actions, whatever they may be, removing someone's ability to choose? Is it removing someone's ability to choose what they want to be called? Is it removing one's ability to choose what they can and can't eat? Is it removing one's ability to choose what time you see them? Like, there's a bunch of ways that we do every day, like remove one's ability to have a choice in a situation. Like, for instance, there was an article in NPR about, like, the headline was something along the lines of, my boyfriend's parents pay for everything and it makes me uncomfortable. For some people, they're like, hell yeah. But for others, yeah. Like, if you're on a date and somebody just pays for the check, that is removing one's ability to choose, because it removes your ability to choose if you want to have more food. It removes your ability to choose if you want to have more drink. It removes your ability to choose, in some situations, in some contexts, how long you can stay in the very place that you're having a time in. It's like, and this is something that, like, that's parameters. Like, you got to lay these out. Like, so, for instance, if you are somebody that's on a date and you just go, I'm just going to pay the bill, don't worry about it. Like, yeah, you're removing somebody's ability to choose what they're going to do with their money, among many other things. And like, I understand that people think that violence is, but that's violence. And again, I defined violence as a removal of one's ability to choose in a situation. And if the only thing that you're kind of getting stuck on is the word violence, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, Zizek talked about this. I forget which book. Somebody in chat might remind me, because this is basically like regurgitating Zizek among like other things, or just like an exercise, a rehearsal of a Zizek take among other smart people. But like that's the framework that I use for violence. And it's like, and then the question is, if you're like stuck on the word violence, then just remove that, just take that out, and just like ask the question, like, how can I allow people to choose for themselves in situations? And then, like, are my actions removing that choice for someone? So yes, misgendering is removing the choice for somebody. However, there's different levels to it. It's not this like slide, it's not this like good, bad. It's a sliding scale. So we have to pay, again, like my point before that is that we have to pay attention to people who do these things on purpose. You have to pay special attention to people who do these things on purpose. For people who don't, like for people who do it unintentionally by accident, yeah, then you contextualize. So you pay special attention to the people who do it on purpose, and you contextualize the people who just do it by accident. Because we're not these like infallible beings that are gonna be like always like eternal. Like not always eternal, but always moving in such a way where like you're never gonna have to worry about like you're never gonna worry about hurting anybody's feelings or causing harm, because we are at 100% acknowledgement mode. Like it's not gonna happen. We're human beings, and human beings make mistakes, and we need to have parameters around that. And again, like, I mean, Haas brought up like, you're taking away my right to choose to be an asshole. I'm not. You're a person that we had to pay special attention to, because by you being an asshole, I would argue that's implying that you want to do this on purpose. And if you're doing this on purpose, that's a problem. You're a problem. So like and again, I don't think you're doing this intentionally, Haas, so I don't want to throw you too deep under the bus, but like, if you're saying like I have a right to be an asshole, great. You're the problem that I'm talking about. You're the person I need to pay special attention, because people who think it's their right to be an asshole are people who will probably don't care about removing one's ability to choose in a situation. And then we can have like what do we do in a society or people who violate people's rights on purpose? But that's like a totally other thing. Yeah, rights, and Poxo brings up a good point. Like, rights have consequences, and if you're willing to accept those consequences, we'll see how far your window of tolerance is. I'm just trying to understand this violence take. It's violence is the removal of one's ability to choose in a situation. So that's violence. And that can manifest in a bunch of different ways. And something cannot be, like, inaction can be violence. So, like, for instance, all those cops that just watched George Floyd die were committing an act of violence. Their actions were removing one's ability to choose in a situation, because they are watching somebody violating that, and their inaction is leading to violence and is violence. That's why, I mean, you hear this in rhetoric, like, especially during like the early stages of like the BLM days of like, silence is violence. And it's like, yeah, that's true. But the problem was is that like, nobody really understood what that meant. Like, why is silence violence? Silence is violence because silence can remove one's ability to choose in a situation, especially if you're a bystander. If you're a bystander watching somebody's rights be violated and you don't do anything about that, that's a problem. Now, granted, there are people who do it by accident. Like inaction isn't always this intentional act of like, I'm just gonna watch it happen. Some people freeze because we're imperfect. Some people don't say anything because we're imperfect. But what we need to try to do to the best of our ability, and it's hard, is in the face of injustice, you have to act to the best of your ability. Because if we believe that something is a right, it's everyone else's duty to honor that right. So if we believe people have the right to their own bodies and you see somebody's rights being violated, then it's your duty to make sure that the rights are respected. Again, I'll say it again because it might get lost in the perennial sauce, is that if something is a right, it is everyone else's duty to honor that right. And there's a willing that comes to that. Rights aren't defaulted. Like there are things that must be declared. And for the longest time, for something like the right to our own body, we've declared that and established that that's a declaration. So again, if you see somebody whose rights are being violated, their body is being violated, and you don't do anything, you're no better than the person committing the action. And like, and it's the same thing happens with words. The same thing happens with words. Like when Nick Fuentes, for example, said all that racism to Pearly Thing's friend on her own podcast, she admitted that she did something wrong because what she did was violence. She removed one's ability to choose in a situation. In this case, choosing how somebody is addressed on her own show. Like, and again, like there's a bunch of ways this manifesting itself, but like to kind of like close out, at least in the YouTube, because I don't know how I feel about the Vosh method of hitting record and just having a segment. I don't know how I feel about that quite yet, but hey, we're trying. But basically, like, violence is the removal of one's ability to choose in a situation. It's a sliding scale. It manifests itself in different ways. If you're stuck on the word violence, and it's fine, but just recognize, like, okay, we're going to remove the word violence for a second and just go, okay, like, we should pay attention to situations where people's ability to choose is removed, and we should pay attention to our own actions so we do not remove people's ability to choose in situations. And that's how you can get to respecting people's pronouns. Just stop making xenogenders a giant deal than it needs to be. Respecting trans people, respecting marginalized people. Like, if you just function on that of like, to the best of my ability, I'm going to make sure I do not remove one's ability to choose in a situation. That's a really easy framework that you can just apply in a bunch of situations for yourself, and also use that outside of like this little brief talk in other areas, you know? But that's all I got. If you want to say bye to YouTube, now's the time. You're under my arm, so sorry about that. Like, this is YouTube chat. Whatever. And I guess I should also, since I'm here, thank the people who support me on Patreon. Yeah, so listen, I'm trying to get to a point on Patreon where, like, it's a sustainable operation, right? Like, And I have a monetary amount for sustainability that's across like all these like platforms. So if you want to be part of the sustainability train, like Jane, Maru, Marking, Frackle, Liberation, Valentine, and Michael, then you should go to the Patreon, which is patreon.com/Joe Lewis with 2 O's. Or if you're on Twitch right now, when you see this, there's a whole sub goal, there's cheer goals, there's dono goals. All of these make sure that I keep my lights on. So the video for YouTube is going to stop here, but now I get to argue with Twitch chat. So let's see what they have to say.